All right, we're good to go. It's wonderful to see all of you this evening. I am so grateful for the opportunity to share this time with you as together we continue our exploration of racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. Today, we focus on part 3 of 6 as we move into the 20th century and look at key elements of federal public policy and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. This marks a period when racism in society and public policy intensified beyond the South, in part because of population shifts like the Great Migration and the continuing outsized influence of Southern politicians on federal policy. All of this was undergirded by our country's perpetuation of the myth of racial inferiority and the persistence of the views of white supremacy. Other countries with similarly sordid pasts have sought to move forward via a process called truth and reconciliation. America is in desperate need of such a process. So we here, for these 6 weeks, are embarking on a search for more truth. Much of it is painful, as we have already seen, incomprehensible even, especially for those of us who believe that every person is a child of God and that we seek justice and peace for all. Much of this history isn't just history, but it is alive and pervasive in society today. I believe that in bringing to light this aspect of America's past that we should have known but didn't, and seeing its impact on our country even today, we may develop a new or a renewed urgency to act, to finally and truly address these profound inequities. So let's continue. A brief recap of our class last week, which was a very difficult one in many ways, a very painful part of our history. We saw the unchecked power of white supremacy, especially in the South, where loss in the war intensified the anger and desire for dominance over those formerly enslaved. Even the presence of federal troops during the short period of Reconstruction couldn't stop it. We discussed the insidious application of the 13th Amendment, particularly its loophole that said slavery was against the law, except in cases of conviction of a crime. And so the states began passing Black codes, laws that specifically targeted Black individuals and led to incarceration, convict leasing, and ultimately public chain gangs. In 1896, a pivotal Supreme Court decision known as Plessy v. Ferguson declared that separate but equal was the law of the land. And we embarked on a period of punitive segregation, which was implemented through Jim Crow laws that affected every aspect of social interaction, ensuring that Black and white people led totally separate lives. All of this was reinforced by terror spectacle lynchings, and these events demonstrated the complicity of not just entire communities, but the leadership of states and legislatures and law enforcement organizations. And in particular, as time moved on, these lynchings were focused on the disenfranchisement of Black people, designed to keep them from voting. And what we see then is being replicated today with less overt violence, for sure, but the goal is the same. And we considered that conditions in the South and opportunities in the North and West led to what is known as the Great Migration, when more than 6 million African Americans left the South, moving to the West and the North, with enormous demographic impacts across our country. I'm going to take a brief moment and just put into context a topic that was of particular interest 3, 4, 5 years ago. And that was the issue of Confederate monuments, which became a flashpoint for questions about race and racism. And to give some context, I want to share a timeline for the construction of those monuments. This is a very detailed chart, and I'm not expecting you to read or see all of the pieces, but I do believe that you can see some trends in the timeline. It begins in 1861, which was the start of the Civil War. It ends in 2016. And what we see is that immediately following the conclusion of the war, there were a few Confederate monuments erected on public lands, state houses, state capitals. And then as the period of the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision was made, the Great Migration began, the terror in the South, we see the enormous increase in the number of Confederate monuments erected on public lands. And that continued with some degree of intensity all the way up to the start of World War II. And then it abated to an extent, and the next push for Confederate monuments took place in the 1950s and 1960s, around the time of the Civil Rights Act. And so the construction and installation of these monuments were seen as a backlash against opportunity and perhaps some more equity for African Americans. And some of these monuments were erected in Utah and Idaho and New Mexico, states that had no involvement in the Civil War at all, yet they were erected as a statement of some sort in terms of what the government valued. So we turn our attention this evening to the mid-20th century, and we're going to look at national public policy in the areas of housing, Social Security, the GI Bill, education, and even the interstate highway system, because these national federal public policies further cemented racial discrimination across our country. And then we will turn our attention to some pivotal events and the impact of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. So we begin with the issue of housing. Until 1917, cities across the country mandated the areas where Black people could live. You can live here, you cannot live here. And so they defined the specific areas where Black people could reside, whether they owned or rented their residences. But in 1917, the Supreme Court issued an opinion in a case called Buchanan v. Worley that declared that the cities mandating the places where Black people could live was unconstitutional. It violated the 14th Amendment because it was government-mandated segregation. But the states and the cities began moving to racially restricted deed covenants that were clauses written into property deeds that declared that that piece of property could only be sold to someone of the same white race. And interestingly, when I have given this class in the past, participants have gone home, taken a look at their own property deeds, and in more than a few instances found that there is one of those racially restrictive deed covenants in the property where they live today. There was a challenge to those covenants in 1926, but the Supreme Court said, no, they're okay. It's all right to say that you can only sell your house to another white person. And so by 1940, 80% of residential properties in Chicago and LA and 85% of properties in Detroit carried these racially restricted deed covenants, and these properties were not available for African Americans to purchase. There was yet another challenge to these covenants in 1948 in Shelby versus Kramer, and the court ruled that the covenants are fine. You just can't enforce them. But if they're written into the deeds and people want to adhere to them, no problem. And so they continued in wide usage and effect until they were finally outlawed by the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So 50 years of these racially restricted deed covenants that kept Black people from moving into properties that were owned by whites. In 1934, Congress passed the National Housing Act, and it was instrumental in alleviating the home ownership crisis that existed at the time. This was following the market crash and the Great Depression. And as a consequence of the economics of the crash, more than 50% of homeowners were in default on their mortgages. And so the housing market was in chaos. There was no opportunity to build more houses. People were having their property foreclosed right and left. It was a catastrophe. At that time, mortgages required typically a 20% down payment, cash down payment, and a 10-year repayment period of the loan. And so the Fair Housing Act created FHA mortgages, which required only a 5% down payment and offered a 30-year mortgage repayment period. And so it had an enormous effect on stabilizing the housing market and encouraging new construction. But the FHA institutionalized racism and segregation by overtly denying mortgages based on race and ethnicity. And it was accomplished against the framework of something called residential security maps. The Homeownership Loan Corporation created these residential security maps covering 239 cities across the country. And it introduced the concept of redlining. Here's an example of one of the residential security maps. This one covers the city of Atlanta in 1935. And these maps were characterized by descriptors of the color zones. Green was labeled best. The blue areas on the map were labeled still desirable. Yellow areas were called definitely declining, and red areas were labeled hazardous. These maps had nothing to do with the creditworthiness of the residents who were living there. They had to do with the proportion of what were considered undesirable populations. And so the descriptions of these populations for these maps included terms like subversive, undesirable, inharmonious, lower grade. And as they began to describe the movement to yellow and blue, the term infiltration was used to describe what was happening to the populations in those areas. And there is an interesting website available today called Mapping Inequality. And it has taken 150 of these residential security maps, and it has overlaid them with the economics and the population of these cities today. And what it finds is that the poorest sections of the cities, even in 2023, are the ones that were labeled red and yellow back in the 1930s. This process was implemented by FHA underwriters, because the way the process worked, banks would issue the mortgages, but the FHA would be willing to insure them based on certain circumstances. And so the banks looked to the FHA to kind of secure the repayment of the mortgages that they would issue. And there was an underwriter's manual that each of the FHA agents used when they went out to make the determination as to whether or not the FHA would insure a particular mortgage. And that manual included statements like, deed restrictions are apt to prove more effective than a zoning ordinance in providing protection from adverse influences. Where the same deed restrictions, these racially restrictive covenants, apply over a broad area, and where these restrictions relate to types of structures, use to which improvements may be put, and racial occupancy, a favorable condition for ensuring a mortgage is apt to exist. Further, the valuator, the agent for the FHA, should investigate areas surrounding the location to determine whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present, to the end that an intelligent prediction may be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. Recorded deed restrictions should strengthen and supplement zoning ordinances, and to be really effective should include the following 10 provisions, one of which said, prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they were intended. Schools should be appropriate to the needs of the new community, and they should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. In the late 1930s, as Detroit grew outward from Center City, white families began to settle near a Black enclave adjacent to 8 Mile Road. By 1940, the Black people were surrounded, but neither they nor the whites could get FHA insurance because of the proximity of an inharmonious racial group. So in 1941, an enterprising white developer built a concrete wall between the white and Black areas. The FHA appraisers then took another look and approved the mortgages only on the white properties. And sadly, this same approach to approving mortgages based on race and ethnicity was adopted by the Veterans Administration in implementation of the GI Bill, and was also adopted for voluntary usage by many individual private realtors. So what was a prospective Black homeowner to do? Hardly anyone in the country could afford a traditional mortgage. They were not eligible for an FHA mortgage, but they had financial wherewithal and they wanted to own their own home. So a new feature sprang up called contracts for deed. And in this particular case, it was an arrangement usually offered by speculators who bought up properties specifically for that purpose. It required a down payment and regular monthly installments from the occupant, but that's where the similarities to a mortgage ended. The sale price and effective interest rate tended to be wildly inflated because these were people who wanted to own a home and were blocked out of the normal housing market. The buyer assumed all the responsibilities of a homeowner, including repairs and taxes, but the seller retained title, along with the power to evict a resident for missing even a single payment. As a result, families who bought on contract didn't accumulate equity, couldn't use that equity as the basis for home improvement loans, college loans, and they faced a long and precarious path to ownership. Not infrequently, when the contract for deed had been fully paid, the resident would be presented with an insurance bill, sometimes thousands of dollars, that had to be paid in a very short period of time, or the contract was void. And so the contract's exorbitant terms, along with the lack of equity to borrow against, left Black families without the means to invest in their properties that contributed to the physical decline in their neighborhoods. Many of these neighborhoods were targeted by the subprime mortgage loan lenders of the 21st century. And some of the characteristics, some of the tactics that were used, these speculators who were looking to buy up properties to make available via a contract for deed would hire a Black woman to push a baby carriage, typically through a yellow or even a blue neighborhood, up and down the streets. And then a representative of the speculator would knock on doors in the neighborhood and say, you know, they're coming. And you don't want to be the last person on this block to sell your house. And so they would often be able to buy up properties at below market value and then sell them as contract for deed at highly inflated prices. And this continued until it was outlawed by the Fair Housing Act of 1968. 35 years of the largest period of home building in American history, and Black families, Black households were to very large extents locked out of the housing market. And so these intentionally discriminatory policies in housing exacerbated housing segregation, which led to educational segregation. And in many places, education was funded by property taxes. So to the extent to which household value began to decline, then the property tax funding available for education was impacted. And this resulted in an unequal education result for Black families living in these neighborhoods that had an impact on their employment opportunities. And that was exacerbated by the fact that as households began moving to the suburbs, industry and business began moving as well. And so the people who were left behind in the red or the yellow areas found that there were fewer and fewer places for them to get employment because the employment opportunities had moved along with the housing. And so the economic impact was enormous. And indeed, the environmental and health impacts of the people left living in these center cities intensified. The consequences of this are seen today. Something called the wealth ratio is the average net worth of a Black family versus a white family. Today, that wealth ratio for a Black family on average is 5% of that of a white family, in large part driven by the inability to build equity and wealth through homeownership, which for decades was the primary source of wealth for Americans. And because of the movement of jobs and industry, the income ratio of the average Black person to the average white person is 60% today. And during a period from 1984 to 2009, that wealth ratio gap tripled. And today, on average, 41% of Black households own their own homes versus 73% of white households. And further in the real estate market, and you may have seen some of these reports on the news recently, the question of appraisals of homes owned by white people versus Black people are affected by this same aspect or element of racial discrimination. If you haven't seen these, there have been quite a number of them reported recently. A mixed race couple, the African-American wife was home when the first appraisal was done, and the appraisal came in more than 6 figures less than the average in the neighborhood. And so steps were taken to remove photographs and African-American art from the home. And the white husband was present when the reappraisal was done, and lo and behold, the appraisal value equaled that of the neighbors. And so the drumbeat continues. As we move to other public programs implemented during this general time frame, the first that we'll look at is the Social Security Act of 1935. And Title II refers to old age. I don't know why they had to use that term, you know? Anyway, old age, survivors, and disability insurance. And when that law was passed, 65% of African Americans were excluded from Social Security because they were domestic or farm workers. They were not included in Social Security. And you may recall that following the Civil War, states passed Black codes that said that those formerly enslaved Black Americans could only hold the job of domestic or farm worker unless they paid an annual license fee in order to take on some other vocation. So that history of the racial population of domestic and farm workers meant they were excluded from Social Security. There were some changes made to the law in the 1950s that opened up the availability, but by then, domestic and farm workers were not considering that this was part of their retirement opportunity. And so the impact continues. And the other programs that were included in the Social Security Act of 1935 were not implemented on a national basis like Social Security. Instead, they were block grants of funds, money sent to the states for local administration. And as you might imagine, there were states that were more or less inclined to make these programs available to African American citizens in their states. Even the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, known as the GI Bill, was affected. It offered mortgages and other loans to veterans and education benefits. When it was passed, it was determined to be the most race-neutral law ever passed by Congress. Excuse me. But once again, as part of the compromise worked out in Congress to pass the GI Bill, the Southern legislators had inserted a clause in the GI Bill that said the benefits would be implemented at a state level. There would be no federal rules about the implementation of the GI Bill. And so as a consequence, in implementing it in various states, there was resulting discrimination in housing, in education. It intensified segregation and had huge economic consequences for African American veterans. In the case of education, there was an opportunity for veterans to be given support for either college or vocational education. Given the economics of Black versus white Americans leading into the war, there were more African American veterans who simply could not take time off from earning money to go to college or go to school. So there was that piece of discrimination. But even more, in looking at whether to refer a Black veteran to a college or university, other than the historically Black colleges and universities in the South, the HBCUs, not a single college or university in the South following World War II would admit a single African-American student. And there were schools in the North willing to admit African-Americans, but they had quotas that had very low numbers of Black students that they were willing to admit. And so the vast majority of African-American veterans were directed toward vocational schools, which might have been fine, not totally fair, but might have provided opportunity. But in many of the instances, when the students got to these vocational schools, they discovered that the equipment and the materials that were provided for the vocational training were only for the actual use by white students. And the Black students were relegated to watching the white students learn a trade because they were not allowed to use the equipment and the materials. And so the discrimination continued, and it too was reinforced by violence, specifically against African-American veterans who had served their country and been honorably discharged. So we move now into the 1950s, and we look at school desegregation, equity in education. We know that in 1896, the Plessy v. Ferguson decision by the Supreme Court declared separate but equal the law of the land, and it had a devastating impact on education. By 1950, you know that I'm a resident of Delaware. By 1950, the state of Delaware had one public high school that Black students could attend. It was in Wilmington, Delaware, the state's largest city at the very north end of the state. And so anyone living further downstate couldn't attend on a daily basis. Perhaps they could find family members or friends that they could live with for the 4 years of their high school education. But of course, many could not. And so by the time of the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, the average educational level attainment of Delaware African-American students was 7.2 years. When the decision was reached in the Brown v. Board of Education decision, it was being predicated on an educational system grounded in underlying assumptions about Black inferiority and inability. And there were white-only schools and Black-only schools. In 5 states, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi, there were 5 million African Americans living, and more than half of them had less than 5 years of education. Because the public education laws passed after the end of Reconstruction dictated that public schools would only be available to educate white students. So in 1952, the suit known as Brown v. Board of Education was filed. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was Fred Vinson, but he was ill and he shortly thereafter died. And so it was necessary for President Eisenhower to name a new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and enable the docket of the court to move forward. And so Eisenhower named former California Governor Earl Warren to be Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And after he had done so, Eisenhower invited Chief Justice Warren to a dinner at the White House, attended by many Southern congressmen and senators. And his message to Earl Warren was to let him know that Southerners, quote, are not bad people. All they are concerned about is to see that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside big, overgrown Negroes, unquote. When the decision was handed down, insisting that schools be desegregated, resistance was massive. The District Court for Delaware authorized a 12-year delay because there was an addendum to the 1954 decision in 1955 that sought to clarify the speed with which desegregation would need to take place. Couldn't, flip a switch and make it happen on a dime. And so the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, said that this desegregation needed to occur with all deliberate speed. And the state of Delaware said, well, that's 12 years. Florida, it was 16 years. In 1970, finally, that time period was considered to have passed. Prince Edward County in Virginia closed all of its public schools from 1959 to 1964. No student could go to a public school in Prince Edward County. Now, there were some white segregationists in the South that sent some money to the county so that they could build some white private schools. But the vast majority of white students couldn't attend, and no Black students could. After this decision, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina declared that the federal courts had no jurisdiction. And Georgia repealed its ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and voted to impeach the Supreme Court. And so what developed became known as the Southern Manifesto, and it was to stall and defy. Stall implementation, defy the orders of the court. In fact, in the state of Alabama Constitution today, it still states that segregated schools are mandated in the state of Alabama. There are some personal stories that occurred during the time period following the Brown v. Board of Education decision, and you may be familiar with a number of them. On the left is a picture of Elizabeth Eckford, one of 9 Black high school students who sought to desegregate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. And you see her, you may have seen this iconic image of her surrounded by a mob of screaming white women. The arrangement that the 9 students had made was that they would meet in the morning and go together into the school. But Elizabeth's family didn't have a telephone and she didn't get the message. So she went to school by herself and found herself separated from her 8 fellow students and had to endure the actions of the mob by herself. There's a book that has been written by Melba Patillo Beals. She was another of the 9 students. It's called Warriors Don't Cry. And it describes the 9 students' experience the full first year at Central High School. And it is a harrowing tale. At one point, when the 9 students were trying to leave the school, midway through the school year, they were followed and harassed and attacked by a white crowd. And at one point, one of the Black adults suggested that perhaps they might leave one of the Black students behind so that the rest of them could escape to go to high school. And you may know the story of little Ruby Bridges, who desegregated the William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans all by herself in 1960. There had been 6 Black students who had been tested and determined to be of superior intelligence and capability, and those 6 little Black 6-year-olds were selected to desegregate the elementary school. But every white parent in the school said that their children, they would not allow their children to be in a classroom with a Black student. And every teacher in the school, all of whom were white, save one, said they refused to teach an African-American student. The exception was Barbara Henry, a teacher who was a transplant from Boston. And she said that she would teach Black students. But the conflict grew so great that the night before school started, Ruby Bridges' parents got a call that the other 5 sets of parents had determined that they could not allow their children to go through this experience. And so Ruby went alone for the full year, escorted to and from the school by armed federal marshals. She and Barbara Henry sat in a classroom and experienced first grade. The grocery store banned her family from shopping at their store. Her father was fired from his job, and her grandparents were evicted from their sharecropper farm because Ruby had been admitted to desegregate the school. There have been enormous consequences of the resistance to the Brown v. Board of Education decision and the desegregation of schools. As of 2021, the states in the country with the lowest levels of educational achievement are Texas, Tennessee, South Carolina, Kentucky, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and West Virginia, a legacy of the actions taken by states and by school districts in an attempt to ensure that African-American students would not find equal access to education. And of course, Norman Rockwell captured the image of this time with Ruby Bridges, labeled the problem we all live with. And indeed, we still live with it today. You might not think of the interstate highway system as something particularly discriminatory. In fact, I believe recently the governor of Florida commented that it was ridiculous to think that a road could be discriminatory. But in fact, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 was the largest public works program in US history, and it authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways that would span the nation. And it authorized $26 billion that would cover 90% of the cost of construction. The other 10% would need to be provided by the states or localities where the roads were built. During the initial construction period, more than 475,000 families were displaced when their homes were taken by eminent domain, more than 1 million people. And the vast majority of those displaced were low-income people of color in urban areas. And in addition to the economic impacts, because this helped facilitate that movement to the suburbs where white people could acquire property and build homes that Black people could not. And so economic and environmental justice issues were a consequence of the construction, particularly as the huge numbers of vehicles were driving through these communities with the exhaust blanketing the areas. And communities were fractured and fragmented, and those separations continue to today. And so against all of this backdrop of inequity, of discrimination, there were those who began to say, you know, this just is not right. And the emerging civil rights movement began to take shape. And so we'll take a look at the broader perspective of the civil rights movement, the heroic civil rights activists and the actions that they took, and the triggering of mass opposition by those actions. One of the things that made a difference in the 1950s was the emergence of television. And I liken it to the emergence of cell phone videos today in terms of making real to those of us not living this discrimination to actually see what happens. And so suddenly on TV screens, people saw police officers with police dogs attacking African Americans, with billy clubs, with fire hoses, with horses, and the reality of the brutality of these actions against people who in many instances were only seeking to vote or to go to school. And all of a sudden in your living room, you saw this. We heard the story of Rosa Parks and the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama. Images of hate and discrimination appearing everywhere. And as I mentioned before, during this period of time, the greatest number of Confederate monuments were erected in states of the entire period of time when those monuments were added. And what you see from these photographs and other stories is that the law enforcement agencies aligned themselves and became the face of violent resistance to integration and to voting rights. They were the arm of a government seeking to keep Black people from voting and to keep integration from happening. And all of that, building on the history that we saw last week, shapes today's relationships between police and communities of color. There are often triggering events of significant time periods. And the significant event that galvanized the civil rights movement was the case of Emmett Till. Many of you may know Emmett Till's story now, but even 5-10 years ago, his story was not so well known. The 14-year-old son of a Chicago resident, Mamie Till, she decided to send her son to spend a week with his uncle and his cousins in Money, Mississippi. And when he arrived, he and his friends went to the Bryant grocery store. And Emmett was known as something of a cheeky 14-year-old, as 14-year-olds can be. And something happened in an interaction between Emmett and Carolyn Bryant, the wife of the owner of the store. And she took offense, and when her husband and brother-in-law arrived home a few days later, they went to Emmett's uncle's house and demanded that he turn over Emmett to them. He tried to resist, but it was futile, and they took Emmett, and he was not seen again until his body surfaced in the Tallahatchie River a number of days later. It was clear that they did not want the body to surface because they had tied the fan blade from a cotton gin around his neck with barbed wire, but surface it did. And his mother, Mamie, declared that when his funeral took place in Chicago, it would be an open casket so that people could see what hate had done to her little boy. And Jet magazine captured a photograph of Emmett's corpse and published it in their magazine for the world to see what hate had done to her little boy. And it galvanized a nation to take action. And so events began to accelerate. The Montgomery bus boycott in 1956. For a year, African Americans refused to take the bus, and finally they were integrated. Sit-ins at the Greensboro lunch counter ended finally with African Americans being served. And something known as the Freedom Riders, which were Black and white civil rights activists who rode buses from Washington, D.C. through the South to test out the law that prohibited discrimination in interstate bus travel. One particular bus was attacked by a mob in Anniston, Alabama, and set on fire. The mob tried to prevent the Freedom Riders from leaving, but they were able to escape. And the police stood by and watched as the bus burned. And 1963 was a pivotal year. It was the time of the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, and Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. I have a story about the March on Washington that I'll share with you if there's an opportunity, but it was enormous. And then that same year, on a Sunday morning in September, the children were in the basement of the 16th Street Baptist Church getting ready for Youth Day when 19 sticks of dynamite set under the stairwell to the basement exploded and killed Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, and Denise McNair. The blast also blinded Sarah Collins, Addie Mae's younger sister. Everyone knew who the 4 men were who had planted the dynamite, but nothing happened. 14 years later, in 1977, one of the men went on trial and was convicted. In 2001 and 2002, 2 of the other men were tried and convicted. The 4th man had died in 1994, and so no action could be taken against him. But children. We know that in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964, 3 civil rights workers, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwimmer, were stopped by police for a traffic stop, murdered, and their bodies buried in a local shallow grave. And that event caused the end of a 75-day filibuster and allowed for passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in hiring, promotion, and firing, public accommodations, and federally funded programs, and strengthened the enforcement of voting rights and the desegregation of schools. Hugely important in terms of the rights of African Americans. You probably have seen the photos of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, the Selma to Montgomery March for voting rights that resulted in Congress passing the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we will talk more about that in a couple of weeks. The Voting Rights Act banned the literacy test. It provided for federal oversight of jurisdictions that historically discriminated against African Americans and looked into the use of still illegal poll taxes. And finally, what we think of as the civil rights era came to an end in 1968 with the assassinations of civil rights activists Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, with a great deal having been accomplished through federal action, enabled and facilitated by the brave activists who worked so hard to see that equity might take hold.
Thank you so much, Sue. You gave us a lot to sit in.
I'm sorry, it took a little longer than I thought.
You're fine. Totally fine.
Yeah, Ben told me that, 16-minute sermons, that's like the limit. And I clearly did like 3 sermons there. Sorry.
Hey, this preaches. This preaches. So I'm going to go ahead and send us out into breakout groups, and we'll pray to close out this time beforehand. I did want to mention a point of reflection. Sue had mentioned how late a lot of the desegregation of schools happened, and a lot of the private schools that were instituted during that time. So it's definitely interesting to look back, particularly at Christian private schools, for everything through middle school through high school, and see when those were initially opened and founded. I know that the schools that I went to 2 Christian private schools that were vastly white. The high school I went to was founded in 1971. And I don't know the exact date of the elementary school I went to, but when I looked it up, it said over 50 years. And then another Christian school down the street said just under 60 years, which, all points to these private Christian schools being white flight schools. So I did want to name that within, and I went to a Methodist elementary school, right? I did want to name that as a part of the church's history and continuing segregation that we have not named nor repented from. So I'm gonna go ahead and pray us into our time of discussion, and then I will break us out into small groups. Y'all join me. God, thank you for opening our eyes to the pain of our siblings. Thank you for making evident the harm that's been inflicted for generations and generations, often in truly devious ways. Help us to move forward with the scales removed from our eyes, that we can see how this injustice continues in our own time and in the spaces that we walk, that we might partner with you to bring it to an end. And that we can bring equality and equity on earth. So thank you for the opportunity to grow as disciples together. In your holy name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.